Technology first. Technology first. Do you all have little ARS devices? Audience response devices? Some of you do, some of you don't. All right. There's a question about to go up on the screen. When the question goes up on the screen, you click either yes or no if you agree with the question. The question is nuclear power a key solution to the world's environmental problems? You've got three possibilities. It's like a vote in Australia. You've got yes, no, or uncertain. So which is it going to be? You vote yes. Is there anybody here who doesn't have a voting machine? You're getting them, all right. That's my wife, by the way, who always supplies what's missing. And she's gone out now to get them, and I can do a running commentary on what will happen now. She will come back with enough voting machines for everybody in this room and the next room as well. There we go. So, all of you get ready to vote. Grab your machines. I give you a countdown of 5, and then answer this question: is nuclear power a key solution to the world's environmental problems? Vote yes, no, or uncertain. Starting 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, vote. Okay, have you voted? No, the clock doesn't keep up with me. I'm much, much faster than the clock. Voting? Yes, good. Now, this is what will happen. We will not put the vote up on the screen. At the end of the session, you will vote again. And then we will put the comparative results on the screen, and you will see whether or not our speaker this morning has swayed your opinions. Now, as to our speaker this morning, you may have heard or indeed be familiar with the Hollywood concept, high concept of a movie pitch. The greatest high concept movie pitch ever pitched was as follows: Arnold Schwarzenegger, Danny DeVito, twins. My high concept pitch for this morning's speaker is Michael Shellenberger, hero, nuisance. Does that work for you?
It's fantastic.
Michael, you're so welcome to Kent. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Frank.
This man has packed more into his 40 years than most people have done. Here's my first question to you. You're a major figure across the whole environmental movement world. Can you remember the first moment in your life when you became conscious that the environment was something you were going to get involved in?
Oh, yes. It was Rainforest Action Network was doing a protest of Burger King for rainforest destruction. And we decided to do a fundraiser in my backyard, and so we sold beer for people to be able to get in.
How old were you?
So that was 6? The beginning. I think that's telling, right? The beginning of my environmental activism.
So your first act
17.
Your first act was involved with beer.
Yes.
And activism.
And intoxication. Yeah.
Yes.
Basically, and getting a large number of teenagers drunk in the name of rainforests. So.
Did you just as a byline? Did you raise any money?
Oh yeah, we did, and we sent it in. We sent it in.
Tell me why. What prompted it? Was it a romantic thing about the rainforest?
It was. I mean, my parents would take us into the redwoods when I was a boy. You know, it was these incredible images of. I mean, it's like from the movie Avatar really captures it, right? Of the bulldozers and the knocking down of trees. I mean, that was probably the first. You know, I was raised by sort of semi-pagan parents, because they couldn't quite go the full pagan. And they really believed that sort of animus or deists or whatever, that nature was alive, that the world was alive, that non-humans had a right to exist. And so that was very deep for us.
So there was a connection to the pulse of the earth.
There was, and it was, I mean, I was also raised Christian, and there's also sort of a different story there, but something that gave a sense that there was a moral duty to take care of non-human life.
Did you have a moment quite early on when you said, this is what needs to be done? And if so, what was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always thought that the world needed to be saved and that there was something I needed to do about it. I mean, I was a cocky little kid, so, you know, I had a lot of sense that I was going to be able to do something about it.
There's a lot of people now think you're still a cocky little kid.
Yeah, and they're not wrong either. I mean, I don't think...
Including just to mention one, Nike.
Yeah, well...
Nike are not very fond of you.
That may be true, although maybe I've changed a bit. I'll show in some of the slides I'll show that I went back to Indonesia, or rather I went to Indonesia for the first time to see how factory workers were doing, since I had been involved in tarnishing their brand in the 90s.
That's where we're going to go with this.
Okay.
The relationship between the environment and the well-being and the future well-being of people.
Okay.
Tell us what you have to show us first, and then maybe we look at your slides.
Well, I want to start by dealing with this question of whether or not we're doing anything on climate change. Because we hear a lot about it, but you don't get very good data on it. So I want to show some of the data, and then I want to put it in the context of what I call the story of environmental progress, which also happens to be the name of our new organization.
So what are we seeing here?
Well, this is just a foreshadowing,
Sure.
as you literary types would call it. So the first question is just, are we in a clean energy revolution? So I just left my think tank after 12 years, Breakthrough Institute. I've started this new group, Environmental Progress. So we just love looking at data. So you can see low carbon power. These are the big sources of low carbon energy. They've been increasing in absolute terms, but they've actually been declining as a percentage of global electricity over the last, 30 years. So that's important, because if you care about climate change, you've got to get to 100% clean power. You know, some people say by such and such a date, but what matters is that you get there. People say to me, well, how much is that, 4.5% of global electricity? Well, it's the equivalent of 60 nuclear power plants the size of Diablo Canyon, or 900 of the world's largest solar farms. That also gives you a sense of the amount of power that comes out of those two technologies. Mostly this is because poor countries are moving to fossil fuels, and that's understandable because they're using wood and dung, which are the worst fuels. But you also see there's one source of low carbon power that's been declining in absolute terms, and that's nuclear. People say, what about solar and wind? Aren't they growing? It's not making up the difference. And you can see every time a nuclear plant closes down, Vermont Yankee was a New England plant, in Vermont nearby. When it was closed down, it was replaced almost entirely by fossil fuels. And so we've lost 4 nuclear plants in the United States in 2013, 2014. It almost wipes out all of the power we get from solar. And now we have half of our nuclear plants at risk of being closed, both because of cheap natural gas, but also because they just don't get the subsidies and benefits that solar and wind get. And if they close early, 37 million cars on the road. If we lose the 15 at imminent closure, it wipes out 4 times as much solar as we get. And it would set back the EPA's clean power goals by almost half. And so this is my pitch to philanthropists that care about the climate. I always say, if we can save all these nuclear plants, it has a carbon value of $100 billion. So just $100 million for us, and you get $100 billion back. So that's kind of the big picture. So we're at risk globally of losing almost 4 times more than we lost over the last 10 years. And that's kind of the opening. And then from here, we talk a little bit about the story of environmental progress.
Well, immediately, and you must know this already, when you use the words nuclear, use the word nuclear plant, people throw their hands up like a frightened aunt.
Right.
And say, but it's going to blow us all to bits.
Yeah.
Put the argument, please, for nuclear power.
So this is, well, let me do it here, because
Sure.
I think that the argument for nuclear power requires that we take a global perspective, a holistic view. And so I like to kind of step back both historically and big picture globally to get a sense of what are we worried about when we think about the environment. So the first big environmental problems that humans create is deforestation. This is in Washington State in the early 20th century. And you can see some of the big environmental problems we create. It's also soil erosion, the Dust Bowl. This is obviously leading to the Great Depression, iconic experience for Americans of self-inflicted environmental harm. The first thing that almost every poor country does if they have rivers to dam is they dam those rivers and they get cheap power. So right during World War I, the US government built a dam on the Tennessee River near Muscle Shoals. It was they wanted to use that dam to produce power to make ammunition. World War I ends, the US government goes, we don't know what to do with this thing. Henry Ford says, I'll buy it for $1. And people go, that sounds like a great idea. There was then a progressive Republican named George Norris, a senator, who very strong sympathies with the poor. And he said, this is crazy. We can convert that factory that makes ammunition to making fertilizer. It's really a very similar process. So that's what they did. It's called the Tennessee Valley Authority. People think of it as a public works project, but it's also an environmental restoration project. You grow more food on less land. You restore and replenish the soils. Tennessee Valley at this time was like sub-Saharan Africa is today. There was malaria, there was hunger. They just lacked energy and a way to produce more power. And so with all that power and electricity, other things happen. You don't need as many farmers, right? Around the world, it was like 80% farmers. We have too many farmers that women go to the cities. This is the first great act of women's liberation, getting jobs in factories. And I think this gets to the question around, you were asking about Indonesia. When I was 20 years ago, I successfully damaged Nike's brand given the factory conditions. 20 years later, last year, I decided to go back. I interviewed factory workers. I met this extraordinary young woman, Suparti. Came from a rice-growing village, didn't want to be a rice farmer. Wanted to move to the city, moved in with her aunt, got a job at a Barbie factory. It was terrible. She did something very brave and she quit, was unemployed for a while, stuck with it. Now she's a labor organizer, a women's rights organizer. She has her own little motorcycle. She just bought a house when I was there, and she's saving money to send her parents to Mecca, which is the dream of young women. And I think what's important here too is that she can love who she wants to love, so she doesn't need to have an arranged marriage, right? That's a huge part of the liberation. Most of us wouldn't want to work in factories, but I think we miss sight of the fact that if you're a subsistence farmer, this is a step up. And so growing more food from less land, we use half as much land per person than we did 50 years ago. And so in places like New England, you see the forests have come back. 80% forest cover today. It was just 30% cover 100 years ago. And of course, all this means more fossil fuels. So Pittsburgh, 1940, you had to turn the lights on to drive through the streets, smoke in the streets, 1940. That happens everywhere. It's China today. But then after a while, you move towards cleaner burning fuels, natural gas or scrubbers on smokestacks or nuclear power. And I think that we have so much ennui about it in the West, but cities do not alienate us from nature. They actually get us, so if you live in Hong Kong, incredibly population dense, if you want to visit nature, you just take your elevator down, 700 stories, or whatever that is, and you just walk out into nature. So part of what we're trying to say is there is a story of environmental progress. After you achieve this, then you've already done much to return the countryside to nature.
I'm the guy you meet on the plane.
Yeah.
Who says, if a dam collapses, it kills a few hundred, a few thousand people.
Yeah.
If a nuclear reactor explodes,
yes, we
have a Chernobyl.
Yes.
What's your answer to that?
Well, let's go there then. So this is sort of this broad picture of how we save nature. We save nature by using less of it, by moving towards energy-dense fuels. We get so rich we can build little bridges across our highways. So this is the big picture in terms of the energy we use. We go from wood and dung to coal to oil to natural gas and I hope to uranium fuels. Right. So what happens is the fuels have more energy in less matter. So that means there's less pollutants, they're using less mining area. The other thing you have to remember though, and this chart shows that you're also using much more energy. So the typical story of environmentalists is that we want to use less energy, but what we see is as we move towards cleaner sources of energy, we use more of them. And we also, more energy means we have more affluence. And so just to give a little bit more context before we get to the nuclear question, because I think it's important, when we get wealthier, we choose to have fewer kids. Suparti, the Indonesian woman I showed, her mother had 5 kids, her grandmother had 10, she wants to have 2. And so you see the population growth rate peaks around 1968. High energy lives lead to smaller families. So what will determine whether the world goes to 16 billion people or peaks at 9 really depends on how quickly Africans, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia can achieve prosperity. So now we're going to get to, I think, where we get the fears of nuclear from. So in the 1950s and 60s, this is from a great history of the era, the discredited theories of Malthus were taken off the shelf and put back to work.
The Malthusian era.
That's right. Irish should be very concerned about Malthus.
Very concerned.
I'm just curious, how many people have heard of Malthus? Would you raise your hand? Good. How many of you know what he said? The idea of Malthus in the early 1700s was there's going to be too many people and we're going to run out of food. What was the basis for this? Well, there was no basis for it, because every time you have more people, we grow more food and you produce more. But he didn't really like people very much. So he makes this argument that we're going to run out of food, and there will be more famine in the future, more starvation in the future, so we should let the famines occur now because that's the humanitarian thing to do, right? This was the argument of Malthus. I'm not kidding, that was actually the argument. This became very useful to justify what the Brits did to Ireland. In fact, the British said then, so the Irish famine, which people imagine was running out of food, the Irish were exporting food the entire time to Britain. There was plenty of meat and potatoes all going to Britain, but they said, well, look, the Irish, we obviously need less of them. So if we have less of them now, then there will be less of them in the future. So that was what was used to justify. This came back in the United States in the 50s and 60s, and it was said, we're going to run out of energy in the future, so therefore we should make energy scarce now. And so the idea was, this is from the Sierra Club director in 1966, the doubling of California's population would encourage more power resources, the scenic character of the state will be destroyed, more power plants, more industry, more cities, more density. We now know that this is exactly the opposite of what is true. People move to cities, the countryside, the forests, and the animals can come back, right? That's what happened in New England, that's what's happened in California. This argument was really driven home in 1968 with this Sierra Club book, which says there's too many people in the world. This gentleman goes to India, he describes Indians as animals, there's too many of them. So here we get to nuclear. So Sierra Club member Martin Litton favored a drastic reduction in population to halt encroachment on park land. Asked if he was worried about nuclear accidents, he replied, no, I really didn't care because there's too many people anyway. I think that plain dirty, if you have a noble end, is fine. And then this is one of the most important anti-nuclear activists of the day. She says, if you're trying to get people aroused about what is going on, you use the most emotional issue you can find. So this is going on in the late 60s. By the time you get to China syndrome, in the 70s, which comes out a few days before the 3 Mile Island accident, everybody was primed to think that nuclear was apocalyptic because the people that were against nuclear plants opposed them they didn't want growth and development in the state. They didn't like cities. But they couldn't, that wasn't a very popular political argument. We're against development and growth. So they had to invent all these really Looney Tune views. So 3 Mile Island happens, it's a full reactor meltdown. It's kind of the worst thing that you can have happen in a nuclear plant. And it's a testament to the essential safety of nuclear. Nobody's harmed. No dangerous amounts of radiation affect anybody, much less anybody getting killed. And yet we imagine that the idea was that it would burn a hole all the way through the earth and go to China, which is wrong in a couple of ways, namely that China is not actually underneath the United States. So this is the context you have to keep in mind. This was something that was done deliberately by institutions.
Nonetheless, there are absolute facts. I can give you one direct personal fact. My sister, mother of 4 children, was accustomed to taking a summer house in a village north of Dublin, about 30 miles north of Dublin, called Skerries. In the early 1950s, 60 miles away on the English coast, in Windscale, the nuclear reactor, there was an accident. The children in Skerries, within a couple of years, started getting cancers. My sister never went back to Skerries for her summer holidays again. 30%, 40% of the children under 10 in that village at that time developed cancer within 2 years after the accident in Windscale. What is your answer to that?
I mean, that's a really interesting case, so I'd like to learn more about that.
Sure. Chernobyl is probably even more interesting.
Yeah. So, let me show some data.
Sure.
So let's go get some of the data. So this is the data from Lancet, which is a British medical journal. It's considered one of the best medical journals in the world.
Absolutely, no question.
They had a comprehensive view of mortality. So there's a couple of interesting things about this chart. So obviously nuclear hardly shows up because it's the safest way to make power. The second thing is that most deaths from energy production are from the pollution they create, not from the accidents. Right. So coal mine collapses kill the most. Deepwater Horizon, an offshore oil rig blows up, a bunch of people die. Sure. Somebody dies in fracking accidents, whatever, natural gas explosion in South San Francisco, a pipeline blows up, 8 people die, instantly 38 homes explode. Nuclear accidents are just so much more mediagenic for people, in part because we have this idea that there's going to be like a bomb or something like that. But the most interesting thing about nuclear, so there's a woman at Imperial College London. She was a young graduate student. Her name is Jerry Thomas. When she was a grad student, she said, we should do tissue samples of everybody exposed to Chernobyl. It's called the Chernobyl Tissue Bank. She's been running it for 30 years. So we track all these people. People sometimes go, well, we just don't know what the effect. It's not true. We've been studying radiation for 100 years. We have incredible data being able to show radiation exposure levels and cancers. And what we find with Chernobyl, what she says point blank, is the only evidence we can find. And Chernobyl was uncontained, there was no containment dome, so it was kind of unimaginable. There's a radioactive fire, like the reactor is spewing radioactive particles into the atmosphere all over Europe. 28 firefighters die of acute radiation syndrome.
Cloud, wasn't there? Chernobyl cloud.
Chernobyl, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely.
But here's the problem. Here's the problem nuclear proponents have.
Yes.
And it's an unfair problem in some ways.
If only there were only one problem, then it would be like much easier.
Well,
yeah.
What I really would love to talk about is the Catholic Church's role in the population control thing. Because Malthus, who had nothing to do with the Catholic Church, they still nonetheless named him as a heretic. In theory, you can only be a heretic if you're a Catholic.
Right.
It doesn't matter. Here's an anecdote that is used by people I know.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, whom I can't name because he wouldn't want me to name him, is a producer at the BBC. He's retired now. He married. They went on honeymoon. His wife conceived on honeymoon. They came back, and 8 months later, not premature, she had a baby with deformities that no doctor had seen in London. And she was a journalist at the BBC. They're both friends of mine. She was a journalist at the BBC. The baby died. It was a stillborn baby, but colossal deformity. And once they'd got over the anguish, which took some time, and she was prepared to get pregnant again, she said, no, I'm not going to do this until I know what happened. She was a very healthy girl. She was an athlete. When they analyzed everything, they found that they were on honeymoon in somewhere like Crete when the Chernobyl cloud passed over. That is the only thing they can connect this to. There was no record of anything wrong with birth in their families. What do you say to somebody like that?
Oh, gosh.
About nuclear power?
I don't know that there's anything I could say to somebody that believes that their baby was deformed by Chernobyl.
Right.
I mean...
But she will tell me that that wasn't the first, that they found several cases.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know,
babies what I'm really saying, Michael, is that's what you're up against. So how do you counter that?
Yeah.
Because the anti-nuclear people do own the PR still.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, here it's a challenge, right? Because I mean, look, babies get born deformed for a very long time, and there's been cancers for a very long time.
Right.
The cancer cluster issue is this really interesting one where it's like, I think people think that cancer should be evenly distributed, but it's just statistically it doesn't work that way. There's always clusters. There's
a very good session on it this morning.
Yeah. So I think what we know from the Chernobyl tissue bank, we also have all of the data from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that people directly exposed, like the firefighters were, who suffered from acute radiation and were affected. But like when you kind of go look population-wise, they have to come up with a number. They have to estimate an extrapolated number of the World Health Organization because they can't find any increase in any of these things in population-wide data. So what they do, World Health Organization, is it says basically over 100 years after Chernobyl, there will be an additional 9,000 premature deaths. And you might think that sounds like a lot, but according to the World Health Organization, there's 7 million premature deaths every year from air pollution. So I don't think I can say anything to someone who thinks their baby was, you know what I mean, and I wouldn't. But I think to the general public, I can kind of go, this is what the science says, and this is not in some weird, obscure journal. This is in Lancet and the World Health Organization.
I chose it specifically to outline what you're up against in terms of the anecdotal PR. Let's now flip the opposite direction.
Yeah.
We live here in Kent. It's an extremely pretty place. It's a very well-run area. The town is extremely well-run and managed. How would our lives be improved if we no longer had propane, fossil fuel, gas, electricity, and had nuclear power? How would our lives change for the better?
Very little. Very little. I mean, look, everyone's already rich.
Right.
So I would think that your conscience would be improved a bit by having less global warming in the world.
Right.
I mean, my bigger concern is that where do we find, I mean, when I go interview subsistence farmers in Africa or in Indonesia or India, they never say to me, there's too many people use too much energy, there's overconsumption. These are only things I hear in rich communities. And that might be just kind of dismissible as the neuroticism or first world problems. But the problem is that we have very powerful institutions that are now working to deny poor countries cheap power. And it's not just nuclear. That Malthusian impulse led to opposition to dam building in poor countries. It's leading to opposition on natural gas exploration. I don't think we have any right to tell poor countries what they can and can't burn, and yet that's exactly what very powerful institutions are doing in Washington. So our argument has been we've got this all wrong. Wood fuel is the worst form of fuel, and uranium is the best, according to the science. So I think what we need to do here is get this broader view.
Right.
Can I show a couple other quick slides? So here's just some other things. People worry about the tritiated water that came out of Vermont Yankee or Indian Point. You'd have to drink 206 gallons of it to equal a year in Denver. Leaking tritium, so the EPA drinking limit is 20,000 picocuries per liter. You can't even register the amount that was coming out of Indian Point. What this has led to is a set of policies that are promoting clean energy at the state level that were sold for climate, but they exclude nuclear, even though nuclear is lower carbon than renewables. This is from the IPCC. You can see nuclear is just 12 grams of CO2 per
This
kilowatt
is like
hour.
the cancer scare with sweetener, isn't it? Do you remember that? If you use sweetener in
You
your
go blind.
coffee,
Right.
you go blind, you get coffee. It turns out that you have to eat something like 9.5 tons of it
Right.
to go blind or get cancer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the same principle.
Absolutely. So obviously this is what you're pointing to. So let's be confronting the facts. I mean, look, nuclear obviously is not a very good career choice, so I don't recommend becoming a nuclear advocate if that's what you're. We're a little bit nuclear's a little bit less popular than oil. And I don't even think this is accurate because look, nobody has nightmares about coal.
Right.
Nobody kind of says my baby's deformed because of coal.
Right.
People say, what about the waste? I used to think the waste was liquid and green, right? Who does? I mean, because I watch The Simpsons.
Sure.
I'm an informed person. So this is all of the nuclear waste from Pilgrim, the nuclear plant in Massachusetts. You know, a couple of guys walk around it. What is called nuclear waste is the old fuel rods.
Right.
We only use 2% of the energy, and then Bill Gates is there's a bunch of advanced nuclear people that want to use up these as fuel.
Yeah.
I think it's fine right there. Everyone worries about moving it somewhere. I just leave it there.
These can't be destroyed, is that correct?
What's that?
They can't be destroyed.
Well, no, it can be used as fuel in advanced reactors.
Right,
But for now, just put it there. I mean, I kind of go, as an environmentalist worried about waste,
Yes.
I worry about the ocean, the islands of plastic in the oceans, or the uncontrolled waste in the air, the chemicals in the environment. This is the most, so only nuclear power internalizes its waste completely.
Right.
There's no other way of making power where you actually control your own waste. So here you can see what is waste? It's the materials that go into the process. Renewables actually produce more concrete and steel, require more of it than nuclear does. So this machine, which I think is a beautiful machine, in Clinton, Illinois, became viewed as something it's not. We project all these things onto it that aren't there. And I can see in the 60s, 50 years ago, you might be like, well, look, we haven't really had much experience with it, but you have 50 years of data now. And I'm glad we've had these horrible accidents, because I just don't know how you can get something worse than Chernobyl, where you have no containment dome and you're spewing all these chemicals into the air. This is the issue I want to go to, though. So and this is the issue we forget. 3 million souls trapped in the wood economy. This is in the Congo. You interview folks that burn wood. Why would you? They use something called liquid petroleum gas in most. When you have a little bit of money, you get charcoal and you say, why do you want to pay for charcoal? Well, I can put a pot of beans on it and then go do something else for an hour. I don't have to sit there and fan the wood. It's the labor saving. This is a kind of, this is a real oppression, right? And if you care about nature, dependence on wood. This is at one of the most spectacular national parks in Africa where the mountain gorillas are. If you don't care about people, I think most of us do, but if you don't care about people, you just care about nature. You worry about wood fuel because Maisha's parents, this is one of the remaining mountain gorillas, were murdered by charcoal mafia who were invading the park and burning wood. And what do we do in the West? We say, well, here, have a cook stove. We say Bernadette, her crops were just eaten by orangutans. She's supposedly in harmony with nature. She doesn't feel like she's in harmony with nature. We say, here, have a cook stove, have a solar panel, but solar panels are not a substitute for wood fuel. They provide electricity during the sunlight hours, but they don't actually provide the kind of power you need to run an electric stove. Supartie shows what people want. They want fossil fuels. So then you end up with, but we don't want this, so this is what we've been doing in the United States. We've been saying, we've been taking development money that would go to natural gas in Africa and diverting it to renewables, and the consequence is real. So if you put all that money in natural gas, 90 million people get power. You take it away if it goes to renewables, only 20 to 30. This was done by Bill Gates, a Bill Gates-funded think tank in Washington. So I think this is what I worry about, is that we're going to actually be kind of kicking away the ladder, so to speak, as poor countries start to rise up.
But what's interesting about this, if you go back, you're in an activism that has been interrupted time and time again. If you go back to the novels of Charles Dickens or Sherlock Holmes, there was something called the London Particular, which was a fog that was yellow, and you could not see your hand in front of your face. And then it was stopped. It was stopped by the Clean Air Act in Britain. By the way, drafted, interestingly, by the man who wrote a wonderful children's book called What You've Done.
Oh, I love that book.
Richard Adams drafted the Clean Air Act.
Oh, I didn't know that.
A very nice coincidence.
Wow.
And why does something like that not travel? Why, for example, do we still have the wood problem in Africa?
Oh, well, this is a great problem. I mean, in some ways, and it's really, I think this is the most important problem, which is we have so much surplus labor in the world, and this will be the next phase of our work, but if you want this process to continue, I think it's a mostly positive process of urbanization, women's empowerment, moving towards cleaner fuels, using more energy. The only way we know to go from being a rich country, from a poor country to a rich country, the only way we know how to do that is through factories and manufacturing. There's some countries that have oil, though a lot of the time the oil is a curse as much as a blessing. Women actually don't get liberated in Kuwait because they didn't go through that process of breaking down the old agricultural social system. That's the only really way we know how countries develop, but it's not clear how, when you go to India, for example, which had some manufacturing, the percentage of the economy in manufacturing actually declined. You go to India, they're surrounded by cheap Chinese products. And then Africa, how's Africa going to make products that can compete on price with China? I think it's a really interesting problem. And I think we haven't really dealt with it. I think instead what we've done is we've said, here, have a solar panel. You can stay in your villages and you'll survive on charity. Or we've said, because we've sort of said, you can't do what we did, which is to, put up trade barriers, support your factories. So I think there's one question of whether or not there's enough manufacturing kind of demand for it to move from China to Africa. But when you look at what's happening in Africa in terms of development, you look at a country like Ethiopia, and what does it do? It has a civil war. Same process in the United States and Europe, by the way. They build a dam, and they now have H&M factories there and cut flowers.
Under the civil war, build a dam. They built a dam 20 years later.
Right.
We know there are heroes in this. Who are the villains?
So I don't want to do villains anymore. Let's just say there's people that are lost souls and minds. Like I said, I think the Sierra Club, I'm going to show a slide later that shows you where they used to be. That was very positive. But I think the big environmental groups are really lost right now. When you're in a situation where you're supporting the closure of our largest source of clean power, which is always replaced by fossil fuels, and then you're opposing poor countries getting modern energy, I think you've lost your way. Yeah. And so we've got to build this alternative to it. Let me just kind of show you some heroes.
Sure.
So I just wanted to point this out to say there is no future. There's just possible futures. We can choose what happens next. And if you care about poor people coming out of poverty, they need cheap power. It's often going to be fossil fuels. If you care about climate change, then it means we have to embrace all of our clean sources of energy. Let me just show a couple of, people know France, it's almost, it's almost 100% clean power. It's basically nuclear and hydro. Germany, people look to Germany, they're doing a lot of renewables, 7 times more pollution per person. Germany is not a model. Their emissions have been going up.
And yet when the French built their very first nuclear reactor in Plogoff, they specifically put it at a place in France as far away from Paris as they could get, and in the middle of the most rebellious province, Brittany. So that's the kind of policy thinking that was going on there.
It's true. I think that nuclear, the technology itself is entering into a new phase where it's been authoritarian, military, government, top-down. We're really the first movement that's been a civil society movement, and we don't take money from any companies for that reason, that is trying to say, look, let's give this technology another look. But I do think that the industry has to change. It can't be what it was. People point to California, they say, You know, we're doing all this solar, but even in California, we have so much, so this is the problem with solar during the day. You get all this energy during the day, but then the sun goes down and everybody comes home from work and they turn on every light in the house. And so what do we do to deal with it? We've had to have this backup power. So we stuffed natural gas into the side of the mountain, which worked pretty well, but then somebody dropped a wrench or something, and then like, half a million cars worth of methane gas goes
isn't
up.
storage still a major problem?
This is it. Yeah. That's the storage. I mean, people go, don't we have batteries? No. I mean, we have batteries for our iPhone, but for the grid, I mean, it's really, we have every car and truck battery in the world would provide a few hours of backup for German electricity. Gotcha. That's it. So what we do is we back it up with natural gas. And so since solar and wind generate power 20 to 30% of the time, it means that most of the time they're going to be substituted for by fossil, not by your iPhone or your Tesla. I don't like to think about bad guys. I just think bad ideas, bad solutions. Okay. This is the last nuclear plant in California. It could run for another 50 years. I swear to God I didn't Photoshop that. That's actually a humpback whale breaching right in front of it. It's just a stunning, the tide pools around the plant are in the most pristine condition of any tide pools in California because they don't allow little school children to come tromp around on them. Touch the anemones and pull the sea stars out. And so if you want conservation, and look at it, it's just natural area all around it. A few football fields provides power for 3 million Californians. My frenemies in the environmental movement want to take that plant down and replace it with natural gas. It produces 14 times more power than our largest solar plant. If it gets 20% of our power, this is the proposal to close it down. They say, well, we're going to do 4,000 gigawatt hours of renewables and efficiency, but none of it is additional from what's already being required. So what we're going to get is more gas. This is a movement that's lost its way. So, all right, I'll just do a couple things. This is the heroes of it. This is one of my favorite discoveries. This is Will Seary. He was a director on the board of the Sierra Club in 1966. When you're in the Sierra Club board of directors, by the way, you have to be a badass. So you have to like climb the Matterhorn or something like that. So they would do that. You'd be like, oh, I should be director of the Sierra Club because I climbed the Matterhorn. Which is why I could never be the director of the Sierra Club. So I read this and I kind of fell out of my chair. He says, nuclear power is one of the chief long-term hopes for conservation. Cheap energy in unlimited quantities is one of the chief factors for allowing a large, rapidly growing population to preserve wildlands, open space, lands of high scenic value. With energy, we can afford the luxury of setting aside lands from productive uses. I kind of fell out of my chair. I was like,
that's a remarkable statement.
I was like, I spent 15 years coming to this view, and I was like, I really could have just read this, and I wasn't open to it. But I mean, I kind of go, we call ourselves new environmentalists, but I have to pay respect to this guy.
Do we take it that he's not a Republican?
I don't know what
sure.
Will was.
That's a serious question. It wasn't a joke question.
He might have been a Republican, I mean, this was
so interesting.
Yeah.
Because several enlightened Republicans have produced little mini policies for energy. Yep. Nobody's taken any notice of, and no chance of getting them through Congress.
Yeah.
Here's a question for you.
Yeah.
There is a new and massive, since you started your activism 20 years ago, at 17 actually, selling all that beer at 17. There is a new and massive double-edged force in the world, social media, the internet. Shouldn't it now be possible to have a single global movement that addresses all of what you're doing?
I love social media. So I'm on social media like all the time. I'm obsessed with it. And what's fun about, so I went from being a kind of I had always had a strong point of view, but when I was at my think tank, you're supposed to be kind of, I'm an analyst, and now I'm getting to be an activist. It's so much fun. So one of the things, because you experiment, you try these things, and you get to be ignorant. And so one of the things that's been really working is we do these little Facebook videos, and they just go like tens of thousands of people watch them. I love Twitter because Twitter is like a salon Absolutely. Where like there's like a really famous guy, and you go right up to him, and you go, hey, Bill McKibben. Yeah. My friend and me, Bill McKibben. I go, Bill, why are you trying to shut down nuclear plants? And he can either ignore you, but you're right there next to him, on Twitter. Let me show you something about Twitter. By the way, this is another one of our heroes, Ansel Adams. Nuclear energy is the only practical alternative we have. So I've become close with Jim Hansen, the climate scientist, who became very pro-nuclear, before I did, really. This is us going to Illinois together. And it's starting to have impact on really social media. Right. The news media then followed the social media, which covered our trip. Speaking of social media, this is what I love about it the most. So this is Twitter. This is my Twitter handle. MD, by the way, are my initials. I'm not trying to pretend to be a doctor. I have a bunch of hardcore green followers and a bunch of skeptics, climate skeptics, right? They don't really believe in climate change. So they go, this guy writes, lots of us skeptics are pro-nuke, probably more skeptics than believers. So what it does is it kind of goes, well, that's interesting. I can have as allies people that don't really care about climate change. They care about nuclear. And you can see that the cause of nuclear is, well, I would say bipartisan, or rather I would say it divides the left and the right. So Mother Jones says closing this nuclear plant causes an environmental disaster, but National Review says this is something different.
But I can tell you.
Well, so then Hillary comes out then, after we're making all this noise, and does not cave in. We sort of give her some support. She doesn't cave into Bernie. And then this was some of the women that we've been working with. These are 3 environmentalist women. They're nerds, actually, despite being, despite not wearing the funny glasses. These are nerds that all got concerned about climate change. Sarah in the middle is 25. She saw an inconvenient truth, becomes a wind engineer, goes into wind and goes, we can't power the world on wind. It doesn't produce power consistently enough. They become nuclear engineers. They've started to lead the industry. This is a sit-in that we did in San Francisco. I tried very hard to get arrested. We're committing civil disobedience in front of, it's hard actually, in front of the Natural Resources Defense Council in San Francisco, which is the very staid anti-nuclear group. And these kids, I was like, who's going to sit in with me? I think it's so interesting. Like, there's nobody in between. You've got these kids, they're 22. These are UC Berkeley nuclear engineering students. We're opening up our office on Telegraph Avenue in a couple of weeks. Gwyneth Craven's on the left. I think it shows all the people that were traumatized by Duck and Cover are not in this picture, right? It's like everybody under the age of 30 and over the age of 60. This was really not covered by the media. The San Francisco Chronicle didn't want to cover it, but it went crazy on Facebook.
I'm about to unleash the citizens of Kent on you now.
Yes. Let me just end with one last Robert Downey Jr. thing. This is my favorite moment of all this. The day the Wall Street Journal covered the Hansen visit with us, Robert Downey Jr. comes up and he goes, it's like half the people, he goes out of his way at this Marvel red carpet thing to give this amazing statement. Half the people are saying no nukes are now realizing nuclear is the best way to go for energy for the future. I think it's natural to re-examine your beliefs as you age up.
Well, re-examine your beliefs. When Stuart Brand spoke here last year and said that nuclear energy is the way to go, you could almost hear the gasp in the room.
Yeah.
Who's going to ask the first question? If you prefer to ask the second question, it's easier. Lady here in front. Here we go. There's a microphone coming to you now.
Marjorie Hart. Michael, one of the huge concerns about going nuke in the future is its economics. In the old days when there was the standard French model, you got scale and economic reality. Today, some of the best environmental organizations really are equally concerned about the economics as well as the whole environmental question. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So I think you made a great thing you said at the beginning. We know how to make nuclear plants cheap. There's really only one way to do it. You build the same kind of plant over and over again. I mean, does that surprise anybody? I mean, it's just, everything is like that, right? Of course, we didn't do that in the United States. Oh, am I losing my video? Because I had one slide after this. That was going to answer her question. Okay. You get music instead. So nuclear today is basically almost everywhere in the world, nuclear is more expensive than fossil fuels. No question about it. Is nuclear more expensive than renewables? No. And the thing you have to understand about it is the issue I mentioned about the intermittency. So you never can replace fossil fuels with solar and wind. You have to replace them really with solar and wind and gas, or some kind of backup. You can have pumped hydro too, but it's limited. So one of the big challenges for nuclear is just that it doesn't get the subsidies or the state renewable mandates that the renewables get. So we just won a nice victory in New York, our first victory. It was a partial victory, as all victories are. And even after that policy goes through, where they save the nuclear plants in New York to keep them running, the subsidy that nuclear gets is still half of what renewables get. So I guess the answer to your question is, well, I would say it this way. Natural gas in the United States is probably going to be cheaper than nuclear for a while. So I think if you don't care about climate, you might be justified in being like, let's just replace all your nuclear plants with gas. I would also just note, however, that natural gas is like the most price volatile fuel in the world. Maybe prices of natural gas will never go up. It's unlikely. Natural gas rigs have been idle because there's so much gas. So I think if you care about having some diversity in your energy mix, you want to keep these nuclear plants going, the cost of keeping them running is actually very low. So this is just existing nuclear. My own preferred policy is just, if you want to solve climate, as I mentioned, you need 100% electricity from clean power sources. I think solar and wind and nuclear should all get the same subsidy or support to achieve that. I don't think we should be picking winners and losers beyond them being clean. And I feel the same way about carbon capture and storage, even though I don't really think it's a very good technology. So that's sort of a long, wonky way of answering your question. I hope I answered it.
Another question? Yes, gentleman here. Microphone, please.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Chris Cook. Two concerns in terms of nuclear that I'd love to hear you address that I think almost came out, but not quite yet, is that, one, you're talking about the wood economy, right? And it seems like you're recommending that nuclear could fill. Okay, why were you bringing up the wood economy and then talking about nuclear? Because I think some of us,
yes.
I know I did, I bridged the two.
Yes, yes.
Because that's the way you presented it.
Yeah, no, I know.
And then
it's Frank's fault, though, because I didn't get to just...
Okay, so can you explain that? And then, because my question goes off of that, so
Okay.
can you explain?
Sure, just briefly. Well, do you remember the part at the beginning when I'm saying that there's like an energy progress? That like coal is better than wood, oil and gas are better than coal, and that I think uranium is the best. So I think everybody should go up the ladder, including us, so for environmental and human reasons. In other words, I think I'm in favor of natural gas when it's replacing coal. I'm not in favor of natural gas when it's replacing nuclear. So I think it's just going in the wrong direction. So for most poor countries like the Congo, and I had some other photos in here, Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's son, is actually doing something good there, which is that he's financing a dam. So most poor countries, they start with a dam, you know. And I think Africa's is potentially, sub-Saharan Africa is in a very potentially good spot because they can actually probably go right to hydro and natural gas and skip coal. They don't have a lot of coal, and they have a lot of natural gas. So that's my view. I just don't think the Congo, they're not pursuing a nuclear power plant. I don't think we should necessarily be encouraging that. South Africa, on the other hand, does have nuclear and has been doing nuclear. In South Africa, one of the ideas is that you do a lot more nuclear in South Africa, and then they can help provide power up the continent. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Then? Okay, so thank you. That wipes away one question I had. But that brings up another. So we're looking to reduce the human effect on global climate change.
Yeah.
The places where the wood economies are have very high population. So if you're going to call for a step towards fossil fuels, wouldn't we be putting more CO2 and creating more of a problem for global climate change then?
Yes. Yes. Which is why I think it's so important that we in the rich world move towards 100% clean power as quickly as possible. In other words, for me, it's just a core ethical issue. It would be wrong to do anything to deny poor countries more energy because it's just so tightly coupled to liberation, I mean, to prosperity. There's no way to climb out of poverty without consuming lots more energy. So for me, that's just like a kind of core value. But I think when you take responsibility for that, you also then have to take responsibility for climate. So that's the connection, is I kind of go, I don't think the solution for climate change is for everybody to become poor. I think the solution for everybody to become wealthy and for all of us to move towards clean sources of energy, with the recognition that when poor countries move towards modern energy, sometimes it'll be hydro, which is pretty low carbon, but a lot of times it'll be fossil fuels. So all the more reason for us to go from being 20% nuclear, 5% wind to 100% clean power as quickly as possible.
I get to ask the last question.
Of course.
You have a high concept moment available to you to influence the vote they're about to make. So Schwarzenegger and DeVito, twins, what's your high concept pitch for nuclear power?
I think I think with great power and wealth comes great responsibility, and I think that turns on to us to take responsibility for our high energy lives and to pursue a cleaner economy without putting other people at
I
risk.
can help you with this. You're saying,
Yeah,
it's
please help me.
just better.
I think it requires a lot of work to embrace this really challenging technology. So I think that I want to say it's easy, it's hard, not easy.
Vote, please. Yes, no, or uncertain.
See how I did,
Has
boy.
he changed your minds? Has Michael changed your minds? 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see the results. And the Russians are not hacking this voting system. Before? After?
Yes!
You won.
I got 29 points.
Michael's
Thank
book
you.
is called Breakthrough, Why We Can't Leave Saving the Planet to Environmentalists. He flew in from California to be here for this session. I think we should thank him.
Thank you, Frank.
Well,
Can I get a copy of that graph for my funders? I think I